My husband slapped me across the face in front of 20 people at Thanksgiving dinner. For a second, nobody moved. Not Mark. Not his father. Not his mother. Not even me. The sound seemed to hang in the dining room of Harold Carter's big brick house just outside Springfield, Missouri. I remember staring at the bowl of mashed potatoes in front of me. There was a little pool of melted butter on top. I don't know why that's what I noticed. Maybe because my brain couldn't process what had just happened. The room smelled like turkey gravy and cinnamon candles. Then Harold pushed his chair back. "That's enough," he said. I thought he was talking to his son. He wasn't. He pointed toward the front door. "You need to leave." I looked around the table. My husband sat there breathing hard. His sister Melissa stared down at her plate. His mother wouldn't even look at me. "You're throwing me out?" I asked quietly. Harold folded his napkin. "You've caused enough trouble for one holiday." I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes shock comes out sounding like laughter. "Trouble." Mark finally spoke. "If you'd stop questioning everything I do, maybe we'd have some peace around here." I touched my cheek. It was already burning. This wasn't our first argument, but it was the first time he'd ever hit me. And somehow that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that nobody seemed surprised. Like they had all been waiting for this moment. Like I was the problem that finally needed to be removed. Harold stood up. "Go back to your farm girl family." His voice dripped with contempt. Then he walked to the front door and opened it. Cold November wind rushed inside. "Leave." Just like that. 15 years of marriage. Gone. I grabbed my purse. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me. Nobody apologized. I walked out into the freezing Missouri night while snowflakes drifted under the porch light. The door slammed behind me. And that was that. Or at least that's what they thought. The drive from Harold's house to my car felt longer than the drive there. I sat behind the steering wheel with the engine running. My hands were shaking. Partly from anger. Partly from humiliation. Partly because it was 28 degrees outside. I stared through the windshield. Families were gathering all over town. Kids were eating pie. Grandparents were telling stories. And I was sitting alone in a driveway wondering how my life had become this. I was 47 years old. Too old for drama. Too old for slaps. Too old to be treated like trash. A memory popped into my head. My father standing beside his pickup truck when I was 10. "People show you who they are," he'd told me. Pay attention the first time. I should have listened. Because Harold Carter had shown me exactly who he was from the day I met him. I met Mark at Missouri State University back in 2008. He was charming, funny, confident. The kind of man who could walk into any room and make friends in 5 minutes. I grew up on a farm outside Ash Grove. My father raised cattle and leased farmland. We weren't flashy. We weren't poor. We simply lived differently. Mark loved that about me at first. Or so I thought. Then I met his family. Harold Carter owned several local businesses. Construction companies, storage facilities, commercial properties. People in Springfield knew his name. Harold loved making sure they did. At our first family dinner, he asked my father what he did. "Dairy and cattle mostly," Dad said. Harold smirked. "Must be a hard way to make a living." Dad smiled. "It keeps me busy." That was all. No arguing. No bragging. No explanations. Just quiet confidence. Afterward, I asked Dad if Harold had offended him. He shrugged. "Not worth worrying about." That was Dad. Never impressed by wealth. Never intimidated by status. Over the years, Harold's jokes became routine. Farm jokes. Country jokes. Comments about tractors and overalls. Every holiday brought another round. My father never reacted. He simply smiled and changed the subject. Looking back, I realized that irritated Harold more than any argument ever could. The snow was coming down harder now. My phone buzzed. "Mark." I ignored it. Then another call. And another. Finally, a text appeared. "You made a scene." I stared at the message. Then laughed again. A scene. The man had slapped his wife in front of his entire family. But somehow I had made a scene. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. A few minutes later, it rang again. This time it wasn't Mark. It was my father. I hadn't even called him yet. "Dad, you okay?" Just hearing his voice nearly broke me. I swallowed hard. "Not really. Where are you?" I told him. "I'll stay on the phone until you get here." Simple words. But somehow they steadied me. I started driving. The roads were slick with fresh snow. Streetlights reflected off the pavement. I drove west toward Ash Grove. Toward home. Toward the one person who had never made me feel small. 40 minutes later, I pulled into the gravel driveway of my father's farm. His porch light was on. He was already standing outside wearing an old brown work coat, the same coat he'd probably owned for 20 years. I climbed out of the car. The moment he saw my face, his expression changed. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, didn't tell me what to do. He simply wrapped me in a hug. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped back. "Come inside." The kitchen smelled like coffee and pecan pie. I sat at the table while he poured 2 mugs. Finally, he looked at me. "What happened?" I told him everything. The argument, the slap, the humiliation, the door, the snow. Every word. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, the room fell silent. Dad stared into his coffee for several seconds. Then he nodded once, just once, and reached for his phone. "Dad," he looked up. For the first time all night, there was something different in his eyes. Something calm, something deliberate, something I hadn't seen before. "I think it's time," he said. "Time for what?" He unlocked his phone. A small smile appeared on his face. "Time they learned who they've been laughing at all these years." I barely slept that night. My childhood bedroom looked exactly the way I remembered it. The same oak dresser, the same faded quilt my mother had sewn years before she passed away, the same window overlooking the eastern pasture. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying. I sat in the dark and watched snow drift across the farm. My life had fallen apart in a matter of minutes. Or maybe it had been falling apart for years and I just hadn't wanted to see it. Around 6, I heard Dad's truck start outside. That surprised me. Most people would have slept in after Thanksgiving. Not Earl Thompson. By 6:30, he was already feeding cattle. At 7, I found him in the kitchen drinking coffee. He looked exactly the same as he always did. Blue jeans, work boots, flannel shirt. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing about him suggested power. That was exactly why people underestimated him. Including me, if I was being honest. "Morning," he said. "You sleep?" "A little." He nodded. "Coffee's fresh." I sat down. For several minutes, we watched snowflakes drift past the kitchen window. Finally, I asked the question. "What were those phone calls last night?" Dad smiled slightly. "Business." That was all he said. Business. Like he'd ordered a part for a tractor. Like nothing unusual had happened. I wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or concerned. Around 9 o'clock, my phone exploded. Missed calls. Texts. Voicemails. Most of them from Mark. I ignored them. Then another call came through. Harold. I almost didn't answer. Curiosity won. The second I picked up, he started shouting. "What did you do?" I pulled the phone away from my ear. "Good morning to you too. Don't play games with me." "Harold, I have no idea what you're talking about." That wasn't entirely true. I had a pretty good guess. His breathing sounded heavy. "Our accounts are frozen." I sat up straighter. "What?" "Our business accounts." For the first time in my life, Harold sounded frightened. Not angry. Frightened. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. I looked across the kitchen. Dad was quietly reading a newspaper, as if none of this involved him. "Maybe you should call your bank," I said. Then I hung up. A minute later, Mark called. I answered. "Linda." His voice was completely different now. No arrogance, no anger, just panic. "What's happening?" I stared at the phone. Yesterday he'd slapped me. Today he sounded like a man standing in a burning building. "I don't know, Mark. Stop lying." "I'm not." He lowered his voice. "Please." The word caught me off guard. Mark never said please. "We can't access our credit lines." I said nothing. "The company accounts are under review." Still nothing. "The mortgage lender called." That got my attention. "What about the mortgage?" There was a long pause. "They're demanding additional collateral." Now I understood why he was scared. The Carter family lived on leverage. Big house. Luxury vehicles. Country club memberships. Vacation properties. Everything financed. Everything dependent on appearances. The image mattered as much as the money. Maybe more. And suddenly cracks were appearing everywhere. By noon I finally asked Dad what was going on. He set down his sandwich. "Do you know what Harold's biggest mistake was?" "He slapped his daughter-in-law." Dad chuckled. "Besides that." I waited. "He thought wealth was what people could see." I frowned. Dad stood and walked toward a cabinet. From inside he pulled several folders. Old folders. Some looked 20 years old. He laid them across the kitchen table. I stared at them. "What are these?" "History." That wasn't helpful. He opened one. Inside were contracts, leases, land agreements. Partnership documents. My eyes widened. Names jumped off the page. Major agricultural companies. Distribution centers. Commercial developers. Regional lenders. Companies I'd heard about my entire life. Dad, he nodded. A lot of people rent land. I laughed. That's an understatement. He smiled. The more I read, the more confused I became. Thousands of acres. Multiple counties. Business partnerships stretching back decades. Millions of dollars moving through agreements I never knew existed. I looked up. Why didn't you ever tell me? Dad shrugged. You never asked. That answer was so perfectly him I couldn't help laughing. The truth was simple. Dad had spent 40 years quietly building relationships. While Harold chased attention, Dad built trust. While Harold joined country clubs, Dad sat through county board meetings. While Harold tried to impress people, Dad helped them solve problems. Over time, those relationships became valuable. Very valuable. The man everyone called a farmer had become one of the most influential landowners in southwest Missouri, and almost nobody knew. Especially Harold. Around 3 that afternoon, another surprise arrived. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. I watched from the window. A man in a suit stepped out. Definitely not someone you normally see on a cattle farm. Dad opened the door before the man even knocked. Afternoon, Earl? Good to see you, Bill. They shook hands. The man entered. I recognized him almost immediately. Bill Davidson, regional vice president of a large agricultural financing company. I'd seen his picture in local business magazines. What was he doing here? The answer became obvious very quickly. The 2 men sat down at the kitchen table, like old friends, because apparently they were. For the next hour, they discussed loans, property agreements, and business obligations. Nothing illegal, nothing shady, just business. Business Harold had apparently never bothered to understand. When Bill finally left, I stared at Dad. How many people know who you really are? Dad smiled. Enough. That evening, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets. The snowfall had stopped. The farm looked peaceful beneath the moonlight. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I felt calm. Then guilt crept in. What if this goes too far? Dad looked at me. What do you mean? I stared into the darkness. I wanted accountability. He nodded. I understand. I didn't want anyone ruined. Dad was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke carefully. Neither did I. That surprised me. He leaned back. Linda, I'm not trying to destroy anyone. Then what's happening? They built their lives on obligations they assumed would always be protected. I thought about that. The protection disappeared. Exactly. No threats. No revenge speech. No dramatic declaration. Just consequences. The older I got, the more I realized life often worked that way. Later that night, I checked my phone one final time. There were dozens of messages. Most from Mark. Some angry. Some desperate. One stood out. A text from Melissa, my sister-in-law. For years, she'd followed Harold's lead. For years, she'd laughed at the farm jokes. The message was short. Linda, I think you need to know something. It's not just about the money. I stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. Call me. It's about Mark. A cold feeling settled in my chest. The financial collapse had been shocking enough. But suddenly I wasn't sure money was the real story. And deep down I knew whatever Melissa wanted to tell me was going to change everything. The next morning I was pouring coffee when my phone rang again. Mark. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. The second I heard his voice I knew something had changed. Not because he sounded angry. Because he sounded scared. Truly scared. Linda, please tell me what's happening. I stared out the kitchen window toward the snow-covered pasture. 3 cows were gathered near a fence line while Dad's border collie wandered nearby. The ordinary scene felt strange compared to the panic pouring through my phone. I don't know what you're talking about. Stop. His voice cracked. I mean it. For years, Mark had always acted like the smartest person in every room. The confident businessman. The successful husband. The man who knew exactly how life worked. Now he sounded lost. The bank froze our operating accounts. I stayed quiet. The construction company can't make payroll tomorrow. Still quiet. The lender called the mortgage. My stomach tightened. Even after everything, hearing it felt different than imagining it. What happened? I asked. You tell me. Then he lowered his voice. Please. Again. That word. Please. I had heard him say it more in the last 24 hours than during our entire marriage. By lunchtime, the local rumor mill was running at full speed. Springfield isn't a small town, but news travels fast when prominent people start having problems. Melissa called. I answered immediately. You wanted to tell me something. There was silence, then a sigh. Linda, I should have told you years ago. I sat down. Something in her tone made my chest tighten. What is it? It's Mark. A pause. Then another. She was struggling. Finally, she said it. He's been lying to you for a long time. I wasn't surprised. Not really. A man doesn't slap his wife in public after 15 years of marriage unless something has been broken inside him for a while. What kind of lying? The money. I frowned. What money? The business money. That got my attention. Melissa continued. Harold knows about it too. Now I was fully listening. According to Melissa, Mark had been quietly moving company money for years. Nothing dramatic at first. Small amounts. Business expenses. Personal purchases. Hidden debts. Bad investments. Things that never appeared on the surface because new loans kept covering old mistakes. Then the amounts got larger. And larger. And larger. Eventually, Harold started helping hide the problems. Not because he approved. Because protecting the family image mattered more. I felt sick. Why are you telling me now? Her answer came quickly. Because yesterday changed everything. I looked down at my coffee. Yesterday. The slap. The humiliation. The front door. The snow. Maybe that moment had changed more than I realized. That afternoon I drove into Springfield. I needed space to think. I parked near a small coffee shop on South Campbell Avenue and sat alone by the window. Outside, Christmas decorations were already appearing. People carried shopping bags. Traffic moved normally. Life continued. Meanwhile, my entire marriage seemed to be unraveling by the hour. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt exhausted. The truth is, revenge sounds satisfying until it starts becoming real. Then it gets complicated. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't dancing around the farm. I was grieving. Grieving a marriage. Grieving trust. Grieving 15 years of my life. And despite everything Mark had done that hurt, a lot. When I returned to the farm, Dad was repairing a section of fencing. I climbed out of my car. He glanced at me. You okay? No. He nodded. Fair answer. We worked together for a while without talking. That was one of Dad's gifts. He understood silence. Some people rush to fill every empty space. Dad never did. Eventually, I told him what Melissa had revealed. He listened carefully. Then he drove another staple into the fence. Does that surprise you? He asked. I thought about it. No. Me neither. That answer surprised me. He looked up. People who spend their lives pretending usually end up trapped by their own performance. I watched him work. Maybe that was exactly what had happened to Mark. He'd spent years trying to look successful, trying to impress people, trying to maintain an image. Eventually, the image became more important than reality. The real shock arrived the next morning. Around 10 o'clock, a black SUV rolled into the driveway. Another one. But this wasn't Bill Davidson. This was someone else. A man in his early 60s wearing a navy overcoat. He introduced himself as Richard Hale, private investigator. I immediately looked at Dad. Dad looked just as surprised as I was. Can I help you? He asked. The investigator nodded. I'm looking for Linda Carter. I stepped forward. I'm Linda. He handed me a business card. I think you should see something. My heart began pounding. He opened a leather folder. Inside were photographs, receipts, documents, travel records, hotel invoices, credit card statements. I stared at them. At first, none of it made sense. Then it did. And when it did, the air seemed to leave my lungs. Mark wasn't just hiding financial problems. He'd been having an affair. For years, not months. Years. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table. The room suddenly felt smaller. My vision blurred. Dad quietly pulled out a chair. I sat down. Richard continued speaking, but his voice sounded distant. The affair had started during business trips, then expanded. Vacation weekends, private accounts, secret purchases, a second life, an entire hidden world operating behind my back. I wanted to be angry. Instead, I felt numb, almost relieved, because suddenly everything made sense. The late-night meetings, the missing money, the emotional distance, the constant criticism, the need to make me feel small. Mark had been carrying secrets for years, and every secret required another lie. That night I sat alone on the porch. The temperature had dropped below freezing again. A thin layer of frost covered the railing. I stared across the dark fields. My marriage was over. Not because of one slap. Not because of one Thanksgiving dinner, because the man I thought I knew didn't really exist anymore. Maybe he hadn't existed for a long time. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. The first one all day. It was surprisingly short. "We need to talk." I stared at the message. A minute later, another arrived. "There's something you don't know." I almost laughed. At this point, that seemed impossible. But then a third message appeared. And this one stopped me cold. "If you go to the Christmas charity banquet next week, everything will come out." I read it twice. Then 3 times. The annual Springfield Community Christmas Banquet was one of the biggest social events of the year. Business leaders, investors, local politicians. Hundreds of people attended. I looked toward the dark pasture. Somewhere inside me, I knew exactly what Mark meant. Whatever secrets were left, they weren't staying hidden much longer. The Springfield Community Christmas Banquet was held every year at the University Plaza Hotel downtown. For most people, it was a fundraiser. For the city's business community, it was also a social event. The kind of place where deals were discussed over dinner and reputations were quietly measured. A week earlier, I would have done anything to avoid it. Now I couldn't imagine staying home. Mark's text kept replaying in my mind. "If you go to the Christmas charity banquet next week, everything will come out." I intended to find out exactly what that meant. The banquet was held on a Friday evening, December 6th, cold enough that patches of old snow still lined the streets. Dad drove with me into Springfield. That alone told me how serious he thought things were. Normally he avoided events like this. He preferred cattle auctions and county meetings, not ballroom dinners. As we approached, downtown Christmas lights reflected off wet pavement. The city looked festive, almost peaceful. Inside the car, neither of us spoke much. Finally, Dad glanced over. "You nervous?" "A little." He nodded. "That's normal." "What if this turns into a circus?" He smiled. "Then let's hope they sell popcorn." For a man who rarely told jokes, that one actually made me laugh. The ballroom was already crowded when we arrived. Nearly 300 guests filled the room. Business owners, bankers, community leaders, local reporters, people I recognized from years of attending events with Mark. Some smiled when they saw me. Others looked uncomfortable. Word had spread. Small cities have long memories and short attention spans. Scandal travels quickly. As Dad and I walked toward our table, conversations seemed to pause. Not completely. Just enough to notice. I felt dozens of eyes following us. Dad didn't appear to care. He simply greeted people politely. To my surprise, many of them greeted him warmly. Some even approached our table. "Earl, good seeing you. How have you been?" Still running circles around the rest of us? Dad laughed and shook hands. The more I watched, the more I realized something. For years, I'd viewed my father through Harold's eyes. A farmer, a countryman, someone simple. Now I was seeing him through everyone else's eyes. A respected businessman, a trusted partner, a man whose word carried weight. The difference was startling. Then the Carters arrived. The room noticed immediately. Harold entered first. Mark followed behind him. Both looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. Like men who hadn't slept in days. The confident swagger I'd seen for years was gone. People noticed that too. Harold attempted his usual smile. It wasn't convincing. Mark spotted me across the ballroom. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Then he looked away. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I missed him. Because I remembered loving him. And now all I saw was a stranger. Dinner was served around 7. Salad, prime rib, mashed potatoes. The usual banquet meal. Halfway through dessert, the evening program began. A local charity director gave a speech. Then a few awards were presented. Everything seemed normal, until Harold Carter stepped onto the stage. A low murmur spread through the room. Apparently, this wasn't on the printed schedule. Harold adjusted the microphone. "Good evening, everyone." His voice sounded shaky. "I'd like to say a few words." I immediately sensed trouble. Beside me, Dad folded his hands and waited. Harold continued. "My family has recently been the subject of rumors." The room grew quiet. "Many of those rumors are false." Mark looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Then Harold made his mistake. He started talking, and talking, and talking. Anyone who's ever watched a person panic knows what happens next. They stop thinking. Harold was no exception. The more he tried to defend himself, the worse things became. Then something unexpected happened. His hearing aid began malfunctioning. At first it produced a faint squealing noise. Harold tapped it. The noise got louder. Several people laughed nervously. Harold grew flustered. "These accusations about company funds are ridiculous." The room immediately stiffened. Nobody had mentioned company funds. Not publicly. Yet. Harold froze. Realizing what he'd just said. Too late. A reporter near the front looked up from her notes. Several people exchanged glances. The damage was done. But Harold wasn't finished. Trying to recover, he blurted out even more. Every business moves money around. The room became completely silent. Mark buried his face in his hands. I almost couldn't believe what I was watching. It would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Then things got worse. Much worse. A man stood from one of the front tables. I recognized him immediately. Bill Davidson, the banking executive. The same man who'd visited Dad's farm. Bill calmly approached the stage. Another man joined him. Then another. 3 business leaders. 3 respected professionals. No drama. No shouting. Just facts. One by one they explained what had happened. Missing funds. Misrepresented financial records. Questionable transfers. Years of hidden problems. Everything carefully documented. Everything verified. The ballroom sat in stunned silence. No speculation. No gossip. Evidence. Real evidence. Mark looked pale. Harold looked defeated. For the first time in his life, charm couldn't save him. Neither could reputation. The truth was simply too visible. Then came the final revelation. The one nobody expected. Including me. The private investigator stepped forward. Richard Hale, the same investigator who had visited the farm. He briefly summarized his findings, the secret accounts, the hidden spending, the affair. Gasps rippled through the room. I felt every eye turn toward me. Oddly enough, I wasn't embarrassed. I felt free. For years, I'd carried responsibility for problems I didn't create. For years, I'd been blamed, doubted, dismissed. Now the truth belonged to the people who created it, not me. Mark finally stood. For a second, I thought he might argue, defend himself. Instead, he looked directly at me. His shoulders sagged. The fight was gone. I'm sorry. The room fell silent again. Not because people were shocked. Because the apology sounded genuine. Maybe for the first time in years, I believed he meant it. I also knew it didn't change anything. Some bridges can be repaired. Others collapse because they've been burning for too long. This one was beyond saving. I nodded politely. Nothing more. Nothing less. As the evening ended, guests slowly filtered out of the ballroom. Conversations buzzed everywhere. The Carter family's reputation had collapsed in a single night. Not because anyone attacked them. Because the truth finally caught up. Outside snowflakes drifted through the cold December air. Dad and I walked toward the parking garage. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me for days. Did you plan all of this? Dad laughed softly. No. Really? Nope. He looked up at the falling snow. People usually do a pretty good job exposing themselves. For the first time all week I smiled. Because he was right. The biggest blow hadn't come from revenge. It had come from truth. And the consequences were only beginning. 3 months later I stood on the front porch of my father's farmhouse and watched the sunrise spread across the fields. Winter was finally loosening its grip on Missouri. The snow was gone. The pastures were turning green again. The cattle were moving slowly through the morning fog. For the first time in a very long time, my life felt quiet. Not perfect. Not magical. Just peaceful. And after everything that had happened, peace felt better than happiness. It felt earned. The divorce became official in late February. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming. No courtroom showdown. No last-minute surprises. By then, both Mark and I were exhausted. There wasn't much left to fight over. Most of the assets everyone thought the Carter family owned outright turned out to be tied to debt. The reality looked very different from the image they had spent years projecting. The large house was sold. Several vehicles were surrendered. Business interests changed hands. The country club membership disappeared. The vacation property was gone. One by one, the symbols of success vanished. The strange thing was that I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. Not the way I thought I would. I felt something closer to sadness. Not for Harold. Not even for Mark. For the years wasted. For the marriage that could have been different if honesty had entered the picture sooner. For all the energy spent maintaining appearances. The whole thing felt unnecessary. Like watching a beautiful old house collapse because nobody fixed the foundation. Mark called me once after the divorce. Just once. I almost didn't answer. But eventually I did. His voice sounded calmer than it had in months. I wanted to apologize again. I leaned back in my chair. The call surprised me. There was no desperation anymore. No bargaining. No excuses, just regret. I know, I said. A long silence followed. Then he laughed softly. You know what's funny? What? Your father warned me years ago. That got my attention. What do you mean? Mark sighed. Remember that barbecue at the farm back in 2015? I did. Dad had grilled hamburgers. The weather had been perfect. Everyone had seemed happy. Your dad pulled me aside. What did he say? Mark laughed again. He told me that character mattered more than money. I smiled. That sounded exactly like Dad. He said if I ever started caring more about appearances, then people I'd eventually lose both. The line went quiet. Neither of us spoke, because we both knew what had happened. Eventually, Mark cleared his throat. He was right. Then we said goodbye. And that was the last conversation we ever had. Life settled into a routine after that. A simple routine. The kind I had forgotten was possible. I moved into a small house about 10 minutes from the farm. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms. A front porch. A vegetable garden. A place that felt like mine. For the first time in years, every decision belonged to me. That freedom felt strange at first. Then wonderful. I started volunteering with a local women's resource center in Springfield. At first it was only a few hours each week, helping recently divorced women with paperwork, budgets, housing applications, basic financial planning, simple things, practical things, the kind of help I wish someone had offered me years earlier. The work mattered. Eventually it grew into something bigger, a nonprofit financial coaching program. Nothing huge, nothing that made headlines. Just real help for real people. And honestly, that felt more meaningful than anything I'd done before. The hardest part wasn't rebuilding my finances. It was repairing my relationship with my daughter, Emily. She was 23 when everything happened. Like many children caught in family conflict, she'd been pulled in different directions. At first, she blamed me. Then she blamed her father. Then she blamed everyone. Mostly because she was hurting. I understood. There were months when our conversations felt awkward and careful. Like we were learning how to speak to each other again. Slowly things improved. One phone call at a time. One lunch at a time. One honest conversation at a time. Healing isn't dramatic. It's usually boring. And that's what makes it real. By spring, we were spending weekends together again. By summer, she was helping me plant tomatoes in the garden. One afternoon, she looked at me and smiled. You seem happier. I thought about that. Happier isn't the right word. No. I shook my head. Stronger. She nodded, as if she understood exactly what I meant. Maybe she did. A few weeks later, I sat on the porch with Dad. The same porch where we'd shared countless cups of coffee over the years. The sunset painted the fields gold. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Dad looked exactly the same as he always had. Old boots. Worn jeans. Work shirt. The man who could have impressed everyone but never cared enough to try. I asked him something I'd been wondering about for months. Why didn't you ever tell people how successful you were? He smiled. The question clearly amused him. What would have been the point? I laughed. Most people would have told everyone. That's exactly why I didn't. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he added something I'll never forget. The richest people I've known rarely needed anyone else to know they were rich. I stared across the pasture. The statement sounded simple, but it explained almost everything. Harold spent years trying to look powerful. Dad spent years quietly becoming powerful. One chased attention, the other built value, and eventually reality won. Looking back now, I realized the slap at Thanksgiving wasn't the moment that changed my life. It was the moment that revealed the life I was already living. A life built around making excuses for other people's behavior. A life spent shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. That night forced me to see the truth. Not just about Mark, about myself. The greatest revenge wasn't taking anything away from them. It was finally refusing to accept less than I deserved. And if there's one lesson I learned through all of it, it's this. Never mistake humility for weakness. Never assume a quiet person has no power. And never judge someone's worth by what they choose not to show the world. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or treated as though you mattered less than others, I hope this story reminds you of something important. Your value doesn't come from someone else's opinion. It never did. And if this story resonated with you, feel free to share your own experience. Sometimes the people who seem the strongest are the ones who have quietly survived the most.